Hi, it's Darren from Little Athletics New South Wales, here to show you some ideas of how you can introduce discus to young athletes in a safe and effective way. We're going to go through some basic discus throwing concepts, relating it to spaceships so it's easy for you to remember and for the kids to remember. We'll talk about some basic safety tips, some key rules, where to start and how to progress beginners, and also some common mistakes that kids make. Now, some equipment you may need when you are teaching discus. I like to use ground markers like some cones. It's also useful to have some hoops as targets, and of course, you're going to need some discuses or some modified discuses. Let's now go through some basic discus rules. Now, number one, you're actually allowed to enter the discus circle from any direction. When leaving the circle, however, you must exit from the rear half of the circle. When you throw the discus, that throw must be completed entirely within the circle. You can't touch the ground outside the circle with your hand or your feet or any other body part. And finally, the discus must land entirely within the sector lines. On the line is out in the athletics throwing events. Apart from that, there's not many other rules that you really have to worry about when it comes to discus. Let's now go through some basic discus teaching safety rules. Number one, it's always worthwhile having a clearly defined landing area so that the kids know where those discuses are supposed to land. Mark it out if you have to. Number two, always make sure that you teach the kids a throwing and a retrieval signal. Now that means that no one is allowed to throw the discus until you give them the signal to do so, and they don't go and collect the discus until you give them the signal to do that. So once they've delivered the discus, they stand and wait until you tell them that they can go out and get it. Number three, now when you are teaching discus initially, some of that stuff may be done away from the discus cage where the kids are lined up, and that's fine, but make sure that those kids are spaced out at least a couple of meters apart so there's no chance of a discus hitting a person next to a thrower. Now, number four, eventually when you move to that discus cage, when the kids are actually throwing the discus, you need to make sure that you do a few things when it comes to cage safety. Number one, any onlookers should be standing back from the cage. There should be no chance that anyone can put their fingers through the cage while someone is throwing, or put their face through the cage, or be leaning up against the cage. Anyone who is not throwing the discus should be outside the cage in a place where there is no chance of them being struck by the discus. Also, when it comes to cage safety, make sure none of the athletes who are waiting are peering around the edge of the cage. Again, they should be in a safe place where if the discus comes their way, the cage will protect them. When it is their turn to enter the cage, wait for the signal to enter the cage, pick up the discus, and in they go. Let's now talk about some ways that you can introduce and progress kids in the discus in what can be quite a complex skill. There's some great things that we can use, some fun activities, and I also like to relate the discus, because it looks like it, being a bit like a spaceship or a flying saucer. Now let's now talk about the discus grip. That's the first thing I like to introduce right from the start. To do this, you put your hand flat on the discus or the flying saucer. Pretend those fingers are like little aliens just peeking out the window to see what's going on down on the ground. Now your thumb is shy, is a bit scared of heights, doesn't want to be seen, stays inside the spaceship. So the fingers are looking out, the thumb is not. So if I turn my hand around, you can see the fingers are just over the edge, pretty much at that first finger joint, but the thumb is sitting on the back. Once the kids are familiar with the discus grip, we can start teaching them how to release a discus. Now, while there is no rule as to how you have to hold the discus or how you have to release it, I'm going to show you the most effective way. Now, a lot of people think when you release the discus, it comes out the back of the hand. And while you are allowed to do that, it's not the best way. The best way for a discus to be released is out the front of the hand over the index finger. And that's a good way to teach kids right from the start. One way that we can teach that is by using an activity I call discus waterfalls. Get the kids to stand with their feet parallel, correct discus grip, holding the discus vertically in front of them. And just get them to practice rolling the discus over that index finger as if the discus is water rolling over the edge of a waterfall, where the discus is the water and your hand is the edge of the cliff. Now, once the kids have got pretty good at doing that waterfall discus activity and have a fair idea how to get the discus out of their hand over that index finger, I would introduce, to further practice the release, some discus rolling. Now, what this involves is maybe putting a target out in front of the kids. It could be a couple of cones. I like using hoops and playing games like discus golf. And you get them to stand there, and on a signal, they step forward and roll the discus towards the target, releasing the discus over that index finger. Once the kids have got pretty good at that discus roll and releasing it over that index finger, the next progression I would use is what I call a discus toss. Now, it is exactly the same as the discus roll. However, the athlete will throw the discus up in the air. They will hold the discus vertically. They will swing the discus past their leg and release the discus so it spins like a wheel in the air in a vertical plane. The idea will then be to land the discus on its edge. And again, you can have targets for the kids to aim for. A tip when it comes to teaching discus to kids, a lot of kids right from the start are traditionally taught to take that side-on discus stance. And while that's not wrong, I think we can simplify it a little bit for beginners. I like to teach beginners, rather than to start in a side-on position, to start in a front-on position where they have their feet, their hips, their chest, their belly button pointing in the direction of the throw right from the start. It's the position they eventually have to get to. I like putting them there right from the start when they're beginners. The underarm discus toss is a way in which kids can actually throw a discus in competition. It is fine for them to use that at a beginner level. As they progress, they will want to start learning how to use a sidearm discus slinging action. I think a great way to introduce this is an activity I call scarecrow claps. So I get the kids to stand side on to the throwing activity or the throwing direction with their arms out to the side like scarecrows. They leave their hand that is out in the throwing direction still while swinging their throwing arm around in a wide arc to perform a clap. And once the kids are familiar with a sidearm slinging action, let's get the discus into their hand. Now, it can be difficult early on to control a discus while you are slinging it around to the side. And in fact, some kids make it even harder by trying to start with the discus behind them. I encourage all kids to start with the discus up in front of their face, calling it a discus sandwich. It looks like a sandwich. You have one hand underneath, acting as the piece of bread. The discus will be in the middle, and the other hand will be on top, supporting that discus. The throwing hand is on top. Hold it up near the mouth, ready to eat, and there's your discus sandwich. The next activity that I really like, before we move on to a full discus standing throw, is what I call discus skimming. Now, this can be done either from a kneeling position or a standing position. It does involve the side-on slinging action, but the idea is for the athlete to skim the discus along the ground in front of them, sometimes to a target, as if they're skipping a stone along water. Or I tell them, pretend you're cutting the grass with the discus. So the idea is a sidearm slinging action, a proper discus over the index finger release, the discus spinning flat but low to the ground, so it is skimming along the surface. Now, assuming that we've got all those preliminary activities done okay, they're gripping the discus well, they're releasing the discus well, let's move them into a very basic standing throw action. That involves them standing side on to the throwing direction, the discus up in a discus sandwich position, taking the discus off their hand, maybe only one preliminary swing. They don't need to do multiple swings. It can waste time and energy. One preliminary swing and then throw the discus so that it spins horizontally in the air like a flying saucer spinning through the galaxy. Now, an extra tip for when we start in that side-on position in the discus. Rather than start with the feet parallel, start with them offset slightly so that the back heel is in line with the toe of the front foot. That allows the child to rotate a lot more easily to the front. Let's go through some really common faults when it comes to teaching kids discus. We'll talk about the grip first. Now, while there is no rule as to how you have to hold the discus, we did earlier demonstrate the preferred way. Some common faults you will see kids do. It is very common for kids to put their thumb over the edge of the discus. And while this is not against the rules, the discus won't spin out of your hand properly. Another common fault is they put their fingers too far over the edge because they're scared they're going to drop the discus. Again, you're allowed to do this, but the discus may slip out of your hand and you certainly won't be able to release it properly. Sometimes kids get the grip pretty right with their fingers over the edge and their thumb on the back, but they will often then, again, scared they're going to drop the discus, lock it in with their wrist. What we want to do is a nice, long, straight wrist when they're throwing the discus, so that type of grip is not advised. One thing that I often see is kids are taught to hold the discus in a crocodile or duck bill grip, as sometimes it's called. Now, while I can understand why this is done, it will allow the kids to throw a discus. I don't advise it. I think right from the start, you teach them the proper grip. Another common mistake you'll see, because the kids are scared they're going to drop the discus, is as they swing the discus back, you'll see them turn their hand over and have their hand underneath the discus on the way back. Ideally, you want their hand over the top of the discus and then they'll bring it through in that correct fashion. So try to teach them to avoid that hand upside down in the withdrawn position back behind them. Another common fault is we see kids often delivering the discus out the back of their hand. And as we said earlier, while there's no rule as to how the discus needs to be delivered, it's better if it comes out the front of the hand. Releasing the discus out of the back of the hand creates a lot less momentum on the discus and leads the kids to having to throw with a bent arm. It is much better for them to have a long arm out to the side. Going back to some of the earlier drills, rolling, underarm discus tossing is the way to get out of this habit. A final mistake I wanted to mention is this. Now, discus, ideally, you use a sidearm slinging action. Some kids will use a cricket bowling type action where they drop their front shoulder and the throwing arm comes over the top, which of course won't give the discus much elevation. So again, maybe just go back, if that is happening, to some skimming discus drills or some very gentle sidearm drills, making sure you tell the kids the discus needs to fly like that flying saucer. So there's some ideas for you as to how you can introduce discus to beginners. I hope that you found that helpful. I say teach the grip first, then teach the release right from the start. Introduce rolling, introduce an underarm discus toss, and then gradually get the arm high so that they are eventually throwing the discus so it flies in a horizontal plane. Hope you have fun coaching discus.